Hello, everyone. I'm Daljit Nagra, and I'm joined by one of my favourite living authors, Fred DAguiar. Some of you may not be aware of his work because you're maybe of a different generation. Before Fred became a great writer. I'm just going to do a very brief biography of him, and then we'll get talking. And Fred, feel free to correct me if I get anything wrong. I've just scanned this off websites. That tacky way we do. Okay, so what I'm going to say is the following. Fred DAguiar is a British Guyanese poet, novelist, playwright, and author of a non-fiction book, A Year of the Plague, which we'll discuss today. Fred was born in London, but was then taken to Guyana for a decade before returning at the age of 12. Fred trained as a psychiatric nurse before reading African and Caribbean studies at the University of Kent. I'm going to skip the PhD bit, you've done that. And passed it wonderfully. Move on to 2003. He took up the position of Professor of English and co-director of the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at Virginia Tech. And I know you wrote that powerful sequence about the Columbine massacre. In 2015, he became Professor of English and Director of Creative Writing at UCLA until 2019. And this is where my biography goes blank, except I know in 2020, you published a book called Letters to America, and then 2021, A Year of the Plague. So firstly, Fred, I want to also mention, your creative debut was Mama Dot in 1985. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And your debut novel was The Longest Memory in 1994, which won the David Hine Prize for Fiction and the Whitbread First Novel Award. And more importantly than that, Fred, we teach it at Brunel University London with our first year students. I've taught that for a few years. And students love it. It's fantastic. That fractured narrative, brilliant book. It goes down wonderfully well. And your most recent publication was just this August, Year of Plagues, a memoir of 2020. So first of all, I just want to ask you where you are right now, Fred. I'm in West London because we're doing this weird thing. Where are you in the world?
In a hotel in London, South London.
And are you here for a short while? Or?
Yeah, doing some readings from Year of Plagues to help it along with a live audience.
Brilliant. Yeah, so we'll talk about that in a minute. So I want to first ask you about your debut, because I don't think people are really aware. Your debut, Mama Doc, was published in 1985. And, back then, there weren't many Black, Asian, minority, ethnic poets. And the ones that were around were often seen as performance poets. And here you were with your debut, really writing these powerful, strong page poems. And I would say the sort of mix of obviously the standard English and the nation languages, to use Kamal Braithwaite's really interesting phrase, why reduce Caribbean and African languages to dialect, when actually nation language is such a brilliant word, isn't it? But what was maybe you could describe a little bit just your reception when your first book came out, because I thought it was really impressive. I read it like 20 odd years ago, and I really got into your work when I first got into poetry.
Well, thanks, Daljit, and thanks for doing this. It's really good to meet you and be in conversation with you, since you know exactly the paths that we walk in England, and the love of the landscape, the traditions that we're moving in, the things we're drawing from abroad to feed into our sense of the nation and so forth. So you know all the nuances, and I appreciate the conversation with you. And from your own work, of course, you've made huge contributions to the idea of belonging, arrival, and then whatever happens to the water that you drink and your body that arrives, and the tongues that we speak in. So I'm so glad that we're having this conversation. 1985. You're taking me back. Well, I'd always been writing poems because, I was always a poet from as far as I could remember. And having left Guyana, and my grandmother died when I was in the UK, I began to put together short memorials about her. And at some point, I realized I wasn't remembering her so much as reimagining what it was like, because the details were small, and I kind of grew a narrative around very, very small details. And I realized too that some of the poems were in nation language, which is, you're right, it's a beautiful term, and some were in the more standard vernacular English, and both were helping me to make sense. It wasn't either or, it was both. and then some. It was this idea that you just articulate the poem, and whatever comes to your aid, you hoover it into the poem to make it work. So there was a sense of orality, a sense of page and stage. I wasn't a performer. I couldn't do what Jean Breeze could do, Linton were able to do, Mutabaruka, Mikey Smith, some poets who were alive back in the mid-'80s. They were able to stand up and hold an audience, and it took a particular dramatic ability to do that. I knew it was hard. I felt shy. I wasn't sure. I had doubt. So I figured out, and through the workshop process, I found the page grabbed me more than the stage. At the time, James Berry had done a book in 1984 called News for Babylon. It was a really good anthology. He pulled together all the people who were performing, and I think Black and Asian writing was going through something of a renaissance back then, because people were talking about a number of poets, Mahmoud Jamal and other poets who were writing, E.A. Markham. We were talking about them writing and about their sense of what it was like to be in the UK. It was almost a first take on it in the poetry world, and working out a poetics that wasn't the usual mainstream line, but it was paying attention to that mainstream line as it tried to announce a new way of saying something. For example, orality at the center of it, some Caribbean things being brought into a UK model and so forth. So the aesthetics were being refined to suit a new community of readers and writers who were engaged with British aesthetics, but saw it as a colonial and post-colonial mixture as well. And you don't want to make too much of a meal of that, because otherwise you get into trouble. But the important thing was the book was in conversation with Englishness, and it wanted to complicate the idea of it by bringing on board something from abroad and saying, hey, we're here, and this is what it means to be here, to love there, to have both as traditions, to pluralize the idea of a tradition. So, yeah.
And it was taken on board by literary critics, wasn't it? That's what really impressed me and pleased me, as a fan of the work. That this is really the first book, isn't it? I think by a Black Asian author, which was actually taken seriously by the establishment and sort of read in the right way, I'd say. And the content was taken seriously. So in a sense, you're really at the birth point of serious literature for us Black, Asian, minority, ethnic writers, to use that baggy term.
No, thanks for saying that. It's an odd time to look back and to think about where did you begin, and what sense does it make? The theory about it is interesting. It always happens, miles later. The event happens, then you kind of reflect on it. At the time, there are a number of writers who we were all on the scene, young poets who were trying to hustle, as the word is, because creative writing hadn't become institutionalized in the way in which you could get a job in creative writing. For me, it was, what do I do now? Psychiatric nursing, shift work was too much. Once I did English with African and Caribbean Studies at University of Kent, which I really enjoyed. I enjoyed the time to read and write. I was a little bit older than the average student, so actually I was ready to really get into libraries and so on. So that was wonderful. And then I guess I was looking around, because I took literature seriously and read everybody around me. When a book came out, I was there to read the book. I expected the same, actually, of my own book. I had this presumption that it would be read. And I guess if you presume something, maybe it becomes a truth. I don't know. But having published in magazines, Poetry Review and so on, I had things in magazines and the radio. So I think my voice was around to show people could hear it and think, oh, yes, he's writing. It sounds worked out. It sounds like he's a reader as well and a writer. So I think those things help people to take it seriously as well. So it was a confluence of things about reading and being a poet. It was a Tony Harrison thing too. He declared, I'm a poet here to read the meter. There was something of working class and a working class ideal, which I also embodied first in my generation to go to university, first person publishing. Coming from a working class background, I knew what that is. I know what that is. I know where the books are, how many there were in the house and so forth. I could find them. They were well thumbed. So I was championing that, but I didn't, I guess I was thinking about Tony Harrison. Yeah, he's actually a good person to mention because he'd had this working class aesthetic, this classic training, trying to reconcile the two in a number of poems, and I love that, the fact that he was in England, within England, speaking about class and saying, look, take on board what we're doing, open up the aesthetics to include a class aesthetic from, working class aesthetic too. So I thought I identified with that struggle. Linton Kesey Johnson he was a young poet, but his book in the 70s was called Dread Beaten Blood. And Dread Beaten Blood was an incredible thing on the scene. It was this dub poetry, allied with music, and trying to bridge the gap between something called lyrics and poetry and saying, look, it's a continuum. Look how this poem is really a song. Listen to the beat. Here's the rhythm of composition. And we'd all been talking about meter and music and song and poetry in a workshop. Here he was in a studio saying, hey, dude. Hey, dude. So he was doing a Beatles. He was actually trying to, John Lennon, he was actually writing songs and where can I say this? And what are the chords? And I love that too. I thought that was a part of the tradition of the troubadour and all kinds of things going back to poets hustling for bread. Not bread as in money, but literally a slice of bread. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, his was very much a musical performance, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Some of those poems think, actually, the interface between performance and page is so strong. Yeah. Whereas yours obviously are that every poem should be read aloud. Otherwise, what's the point of the poem? But yours were textured, complex, and worked through. And in a sense, I guess people like yourself had to suffer with the reception, so other people could come through and find it easier. Now we find that Black Asian poets find it much easier to get published than your generation, where it was so much harder. So I think it's important just to have that on record, even for Royal Society of Literature, that it was a struggle for people of your generation. It just weren't accepted. Whereas obviously my first book was with Faber, and things had changed by then. You can't imagine Faber taking a black author or in the 80s wasn't going to happen, was it? Those big publishers, they weren't prepared to take the risk yet.
Right.
So, the other thing I want to, before we talk about your memoir as well, was one of the things that interests me with the Letters to America. You've got a poem to Derek Walcott and to Kamal Braithwaite, and if we carry on that talk of tradition a little bit about influences, and I guess Walcott is Walcott. Wherever he is, it's his enormous name. Kamal Braithwaite. You refer to him as a history poet in the poem. It's found interesting. You travel up to the Blue Hills, I think, in the plantations in Jamaica. He had a little coffee plantation, which I didn't know about. It's interesting. But the history poet. Well, I thought it was a really interesting phrase. It starts a verse. You start with history poet, and to some extent, is it possible for us as Black Asian authors to escape history? Can we just write the nice lyric, or is that an abnegation of responsibility for us because our history isn't heard? What do we end up doing? Are we by default all history poets? In the sense that you can't even say the word. If you say a black name, it's a history poet who writes about love and other things. What's your take on? I love that phrase, history poet, in there, in that poem.
Yeah, because he studied history literally. I felt he had what we call an historical imagination. That his imagination wasn't just forged in a lyrical space, but it was actually made at the crucible of history and historical events. So I thought that was a fabulous thing, that his poems deliberately walked through historical moments and reconstructed the Middle Passage and things like that.
But you're a history poet as well, and I think I'm a history poet.
Yes. Well,
we have to different aesthetics, don't we? As a poet.
Well, yeah, I was, because I mentioned him, I felt the page I would take from his book was that we should recognize our own historical bodies and the way in which our imaginations are framed, not just by the moment we're in, but by the moments leading up to now. And that a lot of the things that provoked me into utterance were outrages from history. For example, a poem I wrote called At the Grave of the Unknown African. In that poem, I'd gone to Henbury Church Yard in Bristol, and I saw the gravestone, and the person commemorated wasn't named. He was just, one of the stones was just that he was this amazing servant. I thought, why would they leave out his name if they could put a gravestone out? Most working class people didn't have a gravestone. Never mind, even maybe a plot or two, or they had to be piled up together. Who knows? But he was clearly a person of distinction to merit that kind of earmark. But I just felt that they'd missed out on naming him. It seemed like a terrible omission. Others were given names that were classical and didn't relate to them, or they looked strong and they were called Brutus or something. God knows.
Yeah.
I felt the names were misnamings. So I thought I would name that person as an act of retrieval. And I realized it was me trying to engage with the history, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade that found me in London, in England now, with a legacy of the Romans and Britain and so forth, with Black legionnaires, and thinking about what it is that colonial does to bodies. And then if you're writing back to it, how the imagination ought to, as part of its raison d'etre, take on history and be knowledgeable, in a way that's not frightening or bad for the art, but actually strengthens the art because you historicize it. And there's that wonderful poem by Bishop at the fish houses, where she talks, towards the end, she does this incredible thing in the poem where she gives you the ordinary and the details of the quotidian and things around her. And then she does this incredibly philosophical flight. Once she's established the physics, she goes to the metaphysics in the poem. And in the large part of the poem, she does this amazing thing that I think is about history, about flowing and flown. The idea of it having happened and happening now, and both are prerequisites for utterance, for making a poem. And I just thought that poem too was incredibly instructive about history. You can't escape it, but there are other ways of playing it down and making it resonant. So that poem is a wonderful standard for how to write, not just a poem demonstrating writing, but an instruction manual for young. I always use it in my classes to say, look at what you can do. Look how big this poem is. Because I thought, as lyrics are trying to zero in and be looking through a straw and blinkered to kind of make something that was manufactured in a tiny space, she was opening up in this amazing way in the poem and is telling us about the parameters of the poems are. And poetry, there are no brackets. It was this wide field. So she's a superb poet, but she has many, many great poems. That one is like top.
Yeah,
ever.
Absolutely. But I think you do that anyway. You move around through history so fluently, So right from Mama on, you've moved in history. And Longest Memory, which I say we talked at university, partly to teach people the importance of history and how you can write history, not necessarily in a kind of earnest, instrumentalized way, but in an innovative way. So in that sense, you're much more an innovative poet rather than instrumentalizing poet. You don't sort of make sure the artwork you do, like the poetry and novels, not saying here's this book about this and here's this book about this. You do it in a very artful way. So the form is as important to an appreciation. And in the sense that if you took like Longest Memory, if you just took the story and told it, okay, but you've missed all the play that went on.
Yeah, thanks, Daljit. I like this. Keep coming. Yes.
I think it's that thing, isn't it? You want the illusion. You want to feel the author's been having a great time, even if they're writing about something bleak.
No, thank you for saying that. I think I know what a poem is when I started, but actually I discovered I'm writing because I'm not sure. And so I might have something that will get me writing a phrase or something I've heard. And that's where the knowledge begins and ends. Once I take off that springboard, whatever the pool is I'm going into had better be water and shouldn't be empty because I've already taken off the springboard. And so it's an act of trust because I'm not sure where it will end up. And some of that, what I mean?
Each poem has its own unique form for you, doesn't it?
Yeah,
you found the right form for this poem, or just get to the default. Here's another poem in loose free verse.
Right.
Default that we get in poetry.
Right. Yeah, I think you have
a block, isn't it? The worst aspect of it, but I think you're trying out. Also, the other thing, lead on to the memoir now, is I was thinking this book poem on page 10, I Dream JB Says to Me. It reminded me of Yeats. I thought, oh my God, it's Yeats. Like he talks about, the battered kettle is tied at the heel, or he's tied to a dog's tail in the Tower poems. And in these final, if you don't mind me read them out, this body whose hairline shin fracture, short-sightedness, manifold hungers keep my mind turning over even in sleep. So suddenly the mind is restless in the Yeatsian sense, but the body is resting and struggling. And I don't know if that's a way to lead into maybe a year of the plague, which obviously takes its title from a journal of the plague year from Defoe. But what's the tension for you? Initial tension between the body and the mind in that book for you, in the memoir?
Yeah, what a little phrase. Thank you for mentioning. I dream, JB.
I love that poem, by the way. It's fantastic.
I kind of, it was me in conversation with not James Brown, but James Baldwin. In case people are wondering, it could be James Brown, but it's James Baldwin. And having this dialogue with his work, because I think his nonfiction is just phenomenal. The way he writes sentences and argues through.
The digression. I've just got this through the post.
Yeah.
This it just came out recently, last few weeks. This was never published as a novel.
Right.
Partly because of people like James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison doing a hatchet job on him, and his reputation died, didn't it?
Yeah, I didn't realize Baldwin was contra.
Yeah, that Bigger Thomas. He said it's like an Uncle Tom character. Yeah. Because Bigger Thomas is so violent, isn't he? He says this is not a representation of black people.
That's a shame. That's a shame.
I love the fact you mentioned James Baldwin.
Yeah, I take. It's funny when the biography falls away. The work has to. The work is a thing that has its thing. So in a way, the biographical mistakes that people make in their lives, you can almost say, that's gone. Thank goodness. Here's the work. The clutter of that, because the work is where some of the things are worked out that they don't know. And some of the vulnerabilities that they don't wish to show are revealed. And Baldwin had this incredible thing for me where in his sentences, you could see him thinking, you could feel him working out a really complex argument about Black being, which is always hard to pin down and talk about in the middle of very clear lines being drawn between, binaries. And he insisted on this very complex human being, it's a Black gay man talking, coming from an oral preacher tradition into a literary genre, insisting on the political. And he set so many, he broke so many boundaries and created the template for so much of how the writer performs if their bodies is racialized or genderized or whatever it might be that the pressure is, how you insist on clearing a space as a writer. So I do really admire him. And in my conversation with him, I actually met him. I should tell you, I met him once. Yeah, when Mamadot came out, there was something called the GLC, which Greater London Council. And they had this prize, which for literature. And my book got the poetry prize. I think David Dabadine got the nonfiction prize for a book called Hogarth's Blacks. Fantastically original book showing Black people present in Hogarth's 18th century drawings. And all along, he saw Black presence in these working class spaces of people, drinking houses and so on, where he went. And that was brilliant because it became evidence inadvertently of a Black presence right there in the middle of a kind of white life. So David Aberdeen and then Cass Phillips for his book, his first novel. He also won a prize. Yeah, Carl Phillips also won a prize.
That's a trio, by the way. Must have been that company. And
right.
Baldwin was there, was he?
Well, James Baldwin gave the prizes out, and we met him and had a drink with him afterwards and so on. And we were talking to him, and I remember that meeting so clearly because he died a year later, and I'd always taken it for granted that I'd see him again, and so it was a real shock when he died. But I was so glad that we connected, and I read everything by him. I'd read some things at university, but then pursued his work fervently. So when it came to this.
To come back to your plague memoir, the Black body that's under contestation through politics.
Sure.
But in your book, it's through biology, isn't it? It's like data being, and obviously ramifications of the Black body, lockdown, Black Lives Matter. But maybe first you could talk just a bit about the self, the biological Fred DAguiar. In the book.
Yeah, the book began with this diagnosis of prostate cancer, which I had in stage 4. I had to act quickly. Yeah, I had to move quickly. In COVID, it was very difficult. And it was central in my head, of course. It cleared all the furniture in my head, disappeared because it was a diagnosis that floored me. Then I had to act quickly because it was an emergency for me. At the same time, George Floyd was killed in that slow lynching that we saw. And that had everybody in the streets, when the streets were empty, suddenly full of protests. And it took my mind off of my cancer in a way that made me think that my cancer and society's cancer are in conversation in some way. Society is clearly calcified. It clearly has something that's wrong with it fundamentally, and it needs an operation, it needs fixing, it needs dialogue and so forth, therapy. So it helped me to understand my own condition and not to be too blinkered and, weeping into my breakfast, as it were. It's taught me doing that, becoming maudlin, and it helped me to kind of remember that I am in a society. And then it helped me to the third thing too. I mean, so there's medical, my condition, and it's private engagement. Then there's the social idea of George Floyd. And then in reality, something I never thought I'd be living through, Daljit, and that's a pandemic. I don't know what I could predict, and you know what it's like coming through time and being reflective on each decade, but I never thought we'd be in this moment last year that we were in for so long. So that was I'd never seen the society in that way, configured in that way by something. So the pandemic became critical. So there were these three things, and I thought one was enough. Just, cancer was enough. George Floyd's death would have been enough, with Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and a whole list of names, Tamir Rice and so forth. That would have been a litany and a meditation sufficient for a book. The pandemic as well. I thought, you know what, I've got to try and do what poets are able to do, phrase by phrase, stanza by stanza, which is pull in everything that works to keep the poem afloat and give it some kind of momentum that's slightly forward or downwards or whatever you want to say. But that will draw the eyes on and draw the breath out to keep going. And I thought, if I'm doing that in the poem, I should do this with the memoir. I should do everything to count and say, it is a social problem, it is a psychological problem, and it is a philosophical problem, and let's talk about it. So the book pulls all three together in a contemporary discussion. It was also a chance to showcase some of the readings that I've done and some of the music I listen to. I have a playlist for cancer. I have a dialogue with cancer. This sounds morbid. It's not. Playlist for cancer. And that conversations with it, all of which I do in the book.
And were you tapping into other traditions of writing about cancer?
Yeah.
Audre Lorde, obviously, you had the
Thank you for mentioning that. Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning Audre Lorde. Yeah, Audre Lorde, a writer called Anne Bauer, and of course Susan Sontag. These were the three main texts. There's so many. There's a whole web presence of people testifying and bearing witness to their treatments and so on, which I also went into. And then there's a whole drug regime, which I tried to understand. But Audre Lorde was wonderful because she made that connection between her body and Blackness.
Which is a really important connection, isn't it? Which allows your book to become much more textured, I think, because of you make that connection with with Black past.
Mm-hmm.
Really important, isn't it, in the English language? I mean, you're not the sort of overly earnest author. Here's this what happened. This is what happened to me here. This is what happened to me then. And already you're talking in this very complex, rich way about the book. So it became about many more things, whilst also exploring the self and the state of illness. How do you end a book like that? I mean, one thing, and two, did it offer comfort writing it, or did it become a duty, an important message for others? Where do you position it? And then maybe we can talk about the structure as well. How you position it?
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought of a message for others. I didn't have room in my head to care about how it would be received. I thought I should make sense of it for myself to help me get through the days. DAZE or ZE, as opposed, it really was a trial and tribulation. So the writing was reflection. And then I was wondering, if I'm practicing as a poet and writer all these years, it's got to be able to help me in a crisis. And I think one thing writing is wonderful for is reflection. And then it does a thing with the clock. It slows down the clock. It might be the clock of reading and comprehension, but for me, you can slow it down in a way that's wonderful and go back and go forward and go back, as poems do when you're composing them and decomposing them, as Derek Walker would say. So I find it really fantastic to say, well, okay, I have these appointments coming up. I've had these drugs I'm taking, for example, and they're going at a certain pace. It's all very quick. But if I think about it and write about it, I can just, put my foot on the clock and stop it. And that was a lot of fun to be able to slow things down. That's the first thing that helped me. So it wasn't so much therapy as reflection in the writing.
You did the clock and putting the foot down. That's pretty amazing. And the fact that, you went back to work, which, it's a great privilege for us authors. We can go to work to distract ourselves, as it were. Although it's a paradox here, because in the act of going back to work, you're exploring and reflecting, as you say. How do you structurally develop something like that? Because it's ongoing.
Yeah, the journaling.
Write about something that happened in the past. We can structure and control, and we have distance on that. How did you deal with something that's in kind of media res? It's ongoing, and in a sense, you didn't have to stop it because you could keep writing it.
Yeah, there are days when I couldn't write. I was just, too much in a fog or a funk in terms of feeling bad. And when I could write, I wrote quickly. Well, when the diagnosis wasn't the beginning of the book, in a sense, the diagnosis allowed me to think about things that were always in my head turning over. I'd ignored them because I thought, I'm not a nonfiction writer today. Today I'm a poet. Today it's a short. I was insisting on it, waiting in a queue, get in line because these poems are waiting with phrases and so on. I also like to think about things for a long time. But with the diagnosis, a thought has to be worked out as you would an essay or something. You just don't put it aside and say, come back next week because I have other images in the queue or phrases or sounds or whatever it is. So I did find that it was a good discipline to do a kind of journaling, literally a journal, literally this happened today, or this is about to happen. What do I think about it before it happens? So I did that. I looked ahead and I looked back immediately to something. For example, getting back in the early days when you were just doing swab tests for COVID, before the operation, I had to drive to a location to have that done. And it was the early days when they were really concerned to get the sample. And so they would go right up into your nose and because they were overdoing it, because now it's much more sensitive and refined as a test. Back then, anyway, so that was a bit of a trauma, driving out and getting that done, and then getting worried about the result. The result was clear, operation could happen. So those kind of cues and the anxiety at each stage I had to write about. The other one was the reflective part. Music became really important. Listening to the one thing I've talked about is Coltrane's "A Love Supreme," an album of his. There are many tracks in there.
There's biblical overtones to it, aren't there?
Yeah,
very spiritual, but almost biblical, aren't they? I think for me.
Yeah, I wanted secular. Yeah, I wanted secular versions of the spiritual realm.
Yes.
So I did that a lot. I said, well, music, a good poem, a good piece of art, a good food, a good meal, a good movement, yoga. I was thinking of all the ways in which spirituality is in the everyday and the secular, and I wanted that secular world to help me with the sense of a being on the threat, and then to examine Black being to a point where it's Black being, but then it's just humanity, and how do you get to that point if it's a racialized culture? Because George Floyd's death reminded us that. You might think you got tenure and you're safe in the academy, but be careful if you're pulled over late at night or something. Things could go wrong just because you're being seen and read in a particular way. And so, I've always insisted, Daljit, on the philosophy in the middle of our ordinary. It seems important that people. My mum does it when she'll think about a meal practically, but then she'll say something about Guyana. That's a reflection. I'm thinking, that's interesting. I wouldn't have put that in the same curry and the same stew that you just did. But I just love that about the Guyanese. They have this way of the two are side by side. If you give me the physics, I'll give you the physics, but here come the metaphysics right on its heel. And that was a part of my poetry procedure. It became a part of the nonfiction book, which was both current in its reflection and journaling, but also all reflecting my parents. Where do I get strength from? What is this body that's breaking down? What is Black being? Big questions had to be addressed, because I also thought it was my last chance to get it right, because I didn't know where it was going, to be honest.
Well, I mean, it's probably why it receives such incredible reviews, isn't it? So fantastic reviews, and you are a history poet yourself, and this will be an important document in future about Black lives, about pandemic, and kind of global crisis, and how we responded individually as well as internationally. So hopefully it's a book that's going to endure, and we recommend all audiences to buy that book by Fred Daguiar, A Year of the Plague. And just to maybe round off, Fred, what's your state of being at the moment? How's your health, if that's not too private?
Well, yeah, I'm still here, Daljit, and I'll be.
You're in England at the moment, you said. You're going to America soon.
Yes. I mean, I'm still here physically. I'm not. I had an operation, and the operation was cancer came back. I had to have radiation. I had about 40 sessions of radiation, and that really cleared the ground and killed the cancer. And now my blood is safe and clean. So it was a little dodgy. After the operation, I wanted to jump up and click my heels together. I didn't. I can't. I'm too old. I imagined a part of me jumping up and clicking after the operation. But when it came back, I thought, whoa. So there was radiation. I did that. And so now I'm good.
Yeah, and last time I met you was a few years ago, but you're a very fit, healthy, lean individual. So maybe your body was in a good state to fight this off. And I guess the pandemic doesn't really help. You don't really want to get infected, do you? So going on flights and those sort of things are probably quite dicey experiences for you. So I'm really pleased you've come to Britain. Shame we couldn't meet up, obviously, because of obvious reasons. But I really hope you will be writing more work in the coming years, Fred. This won't be our last interview. That hopefully, with Royal Society of Literature, we'll have more connections with you and be able to do more work with you, because
I'd love to.
You're a valuable literary member of British society, and as you are an American, in a sense, a global author, as we all aspire to be. Your work can be picked up anywhere and appreciated because of the philosophical, intellectual, and creative life that it has. Thank you so much for taking time to be interviewed today, Fred.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Great to talk to you, Daljit. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fred.